to actually introduce you to this one, the Life Trajectories. This is a project that I embarked upon around 2010, and it's in the course of, I'm going to give you some, not so much the paper, I hope, I see some of you have read it already, but it's also something that I can share with you as much as the process as the article itself. So I've been writing about Islamism. I mean, my first book was on the Muslim youth movement. So I've been, struggling and thinking about the Muslim youth movement and Islamic activism for a long time. I always tell my friends, that I think I was a member of the Muslim youth movement for about 2 years, and I've been thinking about it for about 20. I think I was much more bitten by the bug, thinking about it rather than being an activist as such. So I was looking at this topic, and I've always been thinking about it, in some way or another. It's in so many different ways as such. And so one day I met with a person from Libya in Germany. It's a long shot, and then he started telling me about himself and spoke to me about that he came from Libya. He was a member of the Da'wah movement. He went into exile in Germany. In Germany, he then slowly started changing. He joined the Sufi movement at one time. Then he wasn't quite satisfied. He wasn't really feeling at home with the Sufi groups. So he joined the Burhaniya, where they have a dhikr, where you have to stand around and you have to, move with your body. He was a bit, he was very self-conscious of himself. I mean, he's telling me this in the course of us discussing, just having a conversation. Then he was asked to be an imam of a local mosque because, he's Arab, and he had done some studies of Islam. And then he became quite a prominent businessman and also a religious leader. So I thought to myself, wow, this is interesting, that his whole story has changed so much over this course of the year. And obviously I was thinking about myself. I also started with the Islamic movement, and I also changed in so many different ways. So I decided, okay, make it a subject, make it a research project. Let's study Muslim, Muslim activist Muslims as such. So, and the questions that I sort of framework that I posed for myself, as at least the kind of questions, the same thing that I did with the Muslim publics was, if you look at Islamic activism, people who are joining these groups, whether it is Islamic State or it is, Muslim Brothers, is this desire to change society. There's a kind of a discomfort with the society. There's something needs to be changed. It's a confrontation with societies. People don't like what they see around them. Confrontation with the self. They're often not so sure about who they are, their identity, a search for authenticity. So these are the kinds of questions that if you look at Islamic activists, they are somewhat involved, sort of engaged with that as such. And so I began to think of, what if we start looking at the longer history of these people, of these individuals? And I looked at the literature, again, see how I'm putting it to you in my method, right? Let's look at the literature. What does the literature say? What is Islamism? Right? So I want to study Islamists, but I want to study Islamist biographies. In my case, I said, let me look at what the literature says. Other scholars who have written about Islamic activism, what are they saying? And I came across what you see here in front of you. I'm going to go through it quickly, but you will see that, I hope that it is clear enough. Islamic activism is a language for a new context. This is Stephen Humphreys, great historian. He wrote this article in 1982, just after the Iranian Revolution. I think he's written one of the very, very insightful articles. He said that Islamic activists, what they do is that they take on a new language. They adopt a language. They think about themselves. They are. First of all, I mean, language like they are part of the movement. They are the Ikhwanis, or they are brothers and sisters. This is the language. They are establishing Muslim societies, or they want to establish Islamic State. He says that when you look at Islamists, they are different from other Muslims because they adopt a very distinct language. That language, they can speak to each other across the board. Other scholars, on the other hand, say no. They emphasize on the fact that there's variety in Islamism. So there's a variety in relation to modernity. This is John Wall, also a historian who's written about this. He said, no, when you look at Islamism, you don't get one group, but you get so many different groups. So that's the dominant scholarly tradition. They write about that. Or you get others who say, no, not all of them are violent. In the recent times, they are not, everybody's not violent. So these are the kind of apologists for the Islamists. They say, no, many a time they are writing for Western audiences, and they say, no, when you look at Islamists, some of them are very violent, others are quite moderate, and others are Democrats. So, people are talking about, this is how they talk about, how they discuss, this is their theories, this is the way they discuss Islamism. Another person who has also written a leading book, these are all quite prominent scholars I'm referring to, it's a defense of tradition against modernity. This is Bruce Lawrence, who says that he wrote a book saying in the late 1980s, 1989 or 1990, he said that when you look at all the fundamentalist movements, and Islamism is considered one of the fundamentalist movements, whether it is in China, India, America, or the Muslim world, these people are actually against modernity. That's how they are trying to counteract modernity. They are going back to the tradition. He calls it defense. It's a kind of in defense of God. They are defending God in a world which is denying that reality. And another scholar who has written specifically on Islamic Islamic activism over a long period of time, from the 19th century, his name is Robert Lee, who argues that Islamism is really a search for authenticity. It's a deep search for who you are as such and what you are. So in South Africa, for example, you had a case that we are Muslim, we're not Indian, we don't want to accept these identities that were given to us. We're searching for something that is more authentic and true self as such. Okay, so sorry, that is what I decided to do. I hope we can say that. Then I started, because I already decided I want to look at stories, at the individual stories. I started looking at, okay, so the scholars are writing about individuals, they are writing about biographies, but how are they writing about it? So I found that leaders often get the lion's share of attention. So when I started this project in 2010, when you look at the Jamaat Islami of the Muslim Brotherhood, you'll have a lot of things written on Hassan al-Banna, or you have Maududi, on Khomeini, Ali Shariati, but you don't get anybody writing on ordinary people. So that's the one, at least, judgment that I'm making. Life trajectories often speak about individualization. So I recorded people that I knew who were involved in South Africa. I even went to Egypt, interviewed some people there, but then 2011 happened, the revolution there, the Arab Spring, so I couldn't go back there immediately. So then I spent a lot of time in East Africa and in South Africa recording interviews with people. And this is what I found, Important in the life trajectory was making a choice. There's always a choice to be made for people who were involved in Islamic activism. The next question, and the choice was not only between being a Muslim and not being a Muslim, but also being an activist Muslim. Which activist Muslim you're going to join? How you're going to choose from one to the other? Who and what is the other? The other always played a very dominant role. The other was always there. In the case of South Africa, the other were the ulama. So always against the ulama. I'm this, but I don't. My other, that means my counterpart, is the ulama. Because generally when people are writing about Islamists, they always say that it's a question of good and evil. If you look at Bruce Lawrence and all of that, against modernity. What I found in many cases, you have to choose between goods. And I found this insight, I found it in the references, but I also found it in the Ghazali's texts. Where does activism take you? I always found a journey, that you go from one to the other. Generally, Islamists the journey never ends. It actually is kind of a continuous journey. Format. So my conclusion was just, Islamists were on a journey, first of all. It's very clearly that they were on this journey that took them, which is quite a torturous journey, as it were. My key, interpretive key that I used for Islamists, for Islamic activists, was the word that I found that is found in Sufi literature, Nafsul Lawama. And in my article, I also then worked on this idea of Nafsul Lawama in the tafsir literature. So when I looked at the tafsir literature, which I've described in this paper, it describes for me the state of what really described. It describes very clearly for me what the Islamic activist was all about. It's a conflict between the self and the self. It's a conflict between the self and the other. It's a conflict between one good and another. It's a deeply conflicted personality, if I can call it that, although I didn't use the psychological term. And I use a nafsul lawama, even though I'm taking it from the traditional thought, but I'm using it as a theoretical lens. I'm using it as an interpretive approach. So rather than saying that, speaking about in the way Paul Ricoeur did it, to say that people have a narrative identity, I said that Islamists particularly, their life journeys give us a very deep idea of what is Islamism all about. Islamism, Islamic activism, is this a nafs al-lawwam. I'm not making a judgment, because Sufism makes a judgment saying that this is not the right place to be in. You have to go to the next stage until you are nafsul mutma'inna. So for me, I'm not making a judgment about that. I'm making an interpretation. I'm setting up an interpretation. This is what Islamism is all about. I gave it to some of the people who it is one of the first papers, not the one that I've shared with you now, and they read it and they were quite happy with it. I don't think they understood what I was saying there, and I was a bit worried that how I'm calling them a nafsul lawwama, because it's not necessarily a positive term to use, but I use it, at least I used it as I said, as an interpretive category. But I did find among some Islamists some who achieved contentment, and in my longer essays I've shown people how some of these Islamic activists, how they moved, from one to the other until they moved out of Islamic activism and then achieved a certain, what might be called, what I call kind of a contentment, which was also in the literature. So in this paper, what you can clearly see, I followed the same, sort of steps as such. I hope that you can see those steps here. But what I'm also showing you is how I'm using the insights that have been developed in the history of Islam. In this case, I particularly look on the one hand Ghazali. Ghazali provided some ideas for me. I read the whole, his second volume, Ihya Ulumuddin, which is about aql and nafs and qalb, all of that. And then I also read the tafsir on nafs al-lawwama. So I didn't read it for what they wanted to read it, but I'm using it to help me to understand a religious phenomena called Islamic activism. And so I know that I've been told by some of my colleagues and friends outside the Muslim world, this is very unusual to do this. In fact, when I first presented in Qatar, and there was a French scholar, they said, oh, that's very interesting, because normally what we do, and I'll conclude with this, normally what we do in Islamic studies, this is what he told me, is that we study Islam because they are our subjects. But what you are doing is you are using Ghazali not as a subject, but as a theorist, as a way to show you what is the human condition all about. So that was quite interesting for me. That was obviously gratifying observation. But I think that since then we have seen a bit more work on Islamist activity, Islamist biographies. But this is a method that I still believe that this is a good method that one can use in order to write about anything that you want to write about, for that matter. I mean, if you want to write about, say, even mosque, and if you write about biographies of people who go to the mosque, you get a very different perspective than if you say, okay, I'm going to go to the mosque and see what it looks like inside, and what power does it hold, or who built it, who decides, which is the Jamaat committees who are running it, which ulama. I have done that in my other work. But in this case, you're suddenly turning it around and you're looking at it from the perspective of people who are attending it and what has been their history over time. Just take a local mosque and you study it from, you see, when we study it, how do we study it? What are the terms that I'm saying use biographies to study that mosque. You get a completely different perspective because you are looking at it from the person who is attending it, maybe attended it once when he was a child, or she was a child, or did not attend it, was not allowed to attend it, and then you have, over a period of time, how the relationship is built around the mosque. Then you're seeing the mosque from the perspective of the biographies. This is what I've done with understanding of Islamic activism. That was 18 minutes. That was not bad. So this is a method that I was, thinking of it as a methodological, method. One of the methods that we've developed at UCT. I think there's much more that needs to be done, but as usual, I think I'm a little bit, I already got distracted and I do other things. So, but I think that this is something that at least I think that it's because of this that I was invited to give one of the keynotes at the International Association for the History of Religions. Then I went to present this because the topic of the conference was on religion, religion in dynamic change, or I forgot now the title, but it was all about the change in religion. So I tried to show this, how you can see the change, not from political and social developments, but from the self, from the individual who is experiencing this over their lifetime. It seems like so obvious, right, to say that. And I think it took us a long time to do something like this.
This piece has been on my mind long before today. And actually I've been using some parts of it for an article that I'm writing. And I was interested, the part that caught me in this piece was this idea of the conflict over goods. And I mean, so without going into too much detail in the article that I'm writing, I'm thinking about the space.
No, do that, yes.
The space where Muslim ethics, or people, Muslim or Islamic ethics, gets negotiated, right? And a lot of the time, people make the assumption or argue that it's in the sphere of the law, but rather it seems to take place in the space between lived reality and what is considered normative law. And then that ethics then in itself, or that changing body of ethics or ethical dispositions, has an influence on how the law gradually either changes or how society in itself has a reflexive idea of what they are in response to how that ethics is and the interaction. So ethics basically is the middle point or the nodal point between the interaction of the Sharia as Islamic law as fiqh and Muslims' lived reality. And so what people are choosing in that instance is not what is evil, what is bad, what is right or wrong, what is halal or haram in effect, but it's a negotiation on various types of goods and the consequence of those things for them in their sort of immediate lives, right? And so, I mean, so what I saw in your article was maybe in not such a technical, theoretical way. The people you interviewed was sort of undergoing a similar process. And so, yeah, I just wanted to share that. So I found this, the way you articulated it, conceptualized, especially with the Nafs al-Lawama, to have been quite intriguing, and how you use Ghazali in that respect.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Well, I think thanks very much. But I think where I would add to what you say, I mean, this text, Ghazali, I think describes it very well. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read it, on the one hand, he speaks about good and evil, but then he also brings about goods and evils as well. He says that the way that describes it, that two angels are pulling you in one direction, or at least opposite direction, and two devils are also, two shayateen are also doing that. So that's why I thought it was so interesting, and then it was speaking to my material. That's what people were doing when they have to choose between one movement and another movement. It's not necessarily between evil and they didn't necessarily see it as good and evil. They saw it as two equally good, and they had to weigh that. And I think you get that within Sharia discourse as well. Where I think you might want, I think it needs to be developed further in order to fully, and that's why I'm saying, that's why I have to stay with this in order to develop this, so that you can develop the theoretical frameworks, or maybe develop in more examples, maybe from other contexts, to be able to do this. We are thinking now about the case of the ethical, and I'm interested in you raising the question of ethics as such. So the position, ethics implying a kind of a position that you're taking. So what term are you using to speak about the ethics as such? Have you given this some thought, maybe? I mean, that's a question that I would pose to you. What is the ethical position? Yeah.
Okay, I'll just briefly, I don't want to talk too much. Briefly, I've been thinking about certain meta-ethical ideas that come out of the ethical tradition in analytical philosophy. And to see how those can inform, because it's not so much there's two things that seem to be happening. The one is depending who you, so in the article I'm thinking of looking at particular Muslim minorities, right? So if you look at, for example, one of the more controversial minorities, the LGBTQ Muslim movement, who are on the margins, they already buy into a particular normative ethical framework, right? And so the choice then is in how they negotiate ethics is what is their, from their lived experiences. They then look at Islamic law. They already have the conclusion that's there. I mean, it's not an investigation. They're not discovering God's purpose. They already know what they want at the end of the day. But there's this ethical grappling of, here's a tradition, and we have to be both respectful and committed to the tradition. But we also have to create a certain type of legal framework that departs from it in material ways. But they want to subvert the tradition, but also be committed to it. And that takes place in a particular framework where this notion of normative ethics takes place. Now, analytic philosophy has given utilitarianism and deontology, but none of these I find are completely sufficient to explain this process that is taking place. So I'm thinking, still a work in progress, of thinking of a more, not of what type of ethical theory but really thinking of the framework of ethics itself. It's something more meta-ethical. What is the value of ethics? And how do we institute, how do we reflect ethical conceptions onto the law, rather than, because that seems to be, so the data that I'm collecting is that people reflect certain ethical positions onto fiqh and the sharia, and usually not the other way around. So in some way, I don't know if I may not be very clear at this stage.
No, it's very clear, thank you. Maybe this second volume of Ghazali might be a very good way of beginning to look at it, because it is a kind of a virtue ethics that you might want to look at around the question that I think the Islamic tradition offers is thinking about adab and akhlaq. So that can be thought of as a theoretical framework, but also a lived tradition.
There is something that, as Naeem was talking about, and also from your Nawama, and also some of the stories that you put into this paper, vis-a-vis to my own experience, which I had when I was sort of a member of MYM and sort of the ideas of the Islamic movement. And I, in my own understanding of what that meant, of the sort of process of Islamization, and also vis-a-vis nationalistic ideas of Muslims in the time after the Caliphate, vis-a-vis Jamal ibn Nasser. And I found that in this contestation of space between national identity and Islamization, Muslims were killing each other. And I found that I kind of immediately found myself in a changing idea of the self, that I felt that where was the virtuousness and the ethics of what was in the Quran, and how Muslims need to communicate and discuss what is the idea of different spaces in a plural way of who we are.
Sorry, I just missed your, because I'm looking at this, sorry. What is the example, what is the case? I heard your question, but not
the case was such that there was two ideas. I was coming from the idea of Islamic movement, and the other person is coming from a nationalistic idea of who Muslims were. And the two views were such as they were like almost sort of contest with each other.
I don't know what the context of South Africa.
The context of Egypt, rather.
Oh, okay.
And what for me was such that if I was then particularly following an idea of Islamization, say of a person called Sayyid Qutb, for example, then I found myself in a space where I found, now how is it that these spaces are contested, and these two ideas and the physicality and the experience of their ideas was there was so much of violence, and there was a reality to that experience. So I felt that I needed to step out of that to find my own experience in what was then the idea of Muslim ethics, to develop the perspective of what is sort of say other ideas which deals with virtuousness other than just the concept of what was political, for example.
Yeah, I think thanks very much. But sometimes we mustn't forget this is about politics, huh? This is about power. I mean, there's a contestation of power, so I think sometimes we have to just call it as it is. I mean, when Nasser came into power, I mean, the Muslim Brothers wanted the power, and he got power. So basically, just I think that the question is right that you say raise the question of Muslim ethics, but there was already the frame that was established by people like Hassan al-Banna, Sayyid Qutb al-Mawjudi was a question of power. I think that played a very important role. It's what you were saying earlier about how that became such a dominant mode, of thinking about Islam.
Yeah, that's why I'm actually saying that the idea of this kind of topic was the idea of understanding what the self actually is, from the point of view of nafs al-lawama. I mean, we have to actually see where the how shall I say, conversation takes place in what is the development of a plural sort of society rather than the context that was political as such.
Yeah, so I think this area was like particularly difficult for a number of us in the faculty, because we didn't have a sociology background, and we've never done anything in terms of anthropology.
Okay.
So it's a hard mix, because then you're almost forced to choose, text rather than being in societies. And then even when you do some reading, for example, I read I don't remember the exact paper, but one was linking how sometimes people convert, but at the same time they have they transitioning, doing a gender transition. So their self obviously is not just about what they want to change in society, but it's also really an internal struggle as well. So they become Muslim and they're are in the process of transitioning. And it seems that that's not such an uncommon thing, but it's something that happens more often than you would expect. So I think the challenge is, how do you actually go from not writing anything in terms of, so I shied away from trying to do interviews and all of that, because I thought, okay, that's just out of my depth, but yet when I read your writings, I saw the value of doing that kind of study. So now, I guess what's challenging is there is an opportunity to incorporate some interviews into my paper, but I'm completely shying away from it because it's just out of my depth. So is there some way, a process of dipping your toe into this kind of writing?
You're right for pointing out this kind of difference between a textual study and a sociological and anthropological. I think sometimes it's just a choice, and you have to also accept the fact that your focus is, if your strength lies in text, don't feel bad about it. Don't ever let anthropologists, because anthropologists will do that to you. They will say, oh, you're not really studying anything because you don't really know what ordinary people are like, and actually that's how I ended up studying anthropology. Because anthropologists kept on telling us, that's not what Islam is all about. You have to look at what the people are doing. And I started also with reading text, but then drawn into the fact that you have to study the society, in order to. I don't necessarily regret that, but I can recall the fact that you not that you tell people, they'll tell you, but the text, the anthropological literature is very accusatory. Saying, you are only studying the text, we are studying the real thing. And the other way around, then you have, you're just studying people that you don't know anything about. So, I think the first thing is you have to think about the value of whichever you study, because there's always going to be an aspect that you are studying, and you cannot cover everything. So I think that's. But if your topic, for example, would benefit from an interview, I think that can make a big difference. So if you are studying, even if you're studying a text and you know somebody who has written about it, if you can formulate some questions like you are doing now, it can actually, it can work that. But I think it requires a technique to do some interview. Just don't go with a tape recorder and decide, okay, what are my questions now? There should be some. I was thinking about this session, maybe another time, to do some kind of training in how to do interviews and for what purposes. Because it depends a lot. I remember the first time I did interviews, I actually got hardly any information that I could use. And then later, I learned from the social historians, and they basically do really good interview styles. Now I think I can arrive at your place and I'll ask you, okay, now let me ask you questions, and you won't stop talking for an hour. But it does still take a lot of ways of crossing the two. There are some anthropologists who claim that they are meeting the two. In fact, people like, I once made a presentation and I accused the anthropologists of not understanding Islam because they don't understand the text. And there was, Robert Hefner and two specialists on Indonesian studies who told me, oh, but that's an old thing, I told them, yeah, but when I see your work, I don't think I understand the text. But anyway, there's a sore point. But because it's a difficult thing to cross, to divide, to have a kind of a deep understanding of the text and to actually do. Maybe you will do it one day, but at the moment it's instead of a crossing. It's a very difficult thing to divide. But I see use interviews just to add insight to what you're doing. Don't think of you now turning to become an anthropologist, because I think then you will just add too many theories.
My question is also about theories, particularly your use of nafsul lawama. So you use the Ghazalian definition or conceptualization of what that is. So how did you come to that choice rather than any other Sufi understanding of nafsul lawama? Because not all of them, for example, would see it as, like you said, possibly a negative state.
Well, I knew it because of my Sufi readings, right? My readings of Sufi texts. This is quite common. This is a normal, at least when Sufis always tell you this is a journey of the soul. So I was just basically looking for information. So I was scouring around. And in fact, I use eventually the tafsir and Ghazali. I use both, not only Ghazali. I could have used somebody else. I didn't find Ghazali to be writing a very, I didn't do it was a short art, it was an article. So that's why I'm saying you have to write this again in a whole book, right? So you can then develop it. I'm not familiar with the fact where, say, maybe somebody like Ghazali would be different from some of the earlier scholars and how the nuanced differences. For me, I was not looking for that. You can see how I'm working with this material, starting with an idea that might sound interesting for me, because I knew what was the meaning of nafsul lawama. And then what I did is that I used a text like Ghazali because it had an extensive discussion. So sometimes I would find in some Sufi texts there would just be 2 or 3 lines, for example, and I didn't find it sufficient. So that's the process that you have to go, because unlike what you find in sort of modern writers, like, say, people like who would write a theoretical piece and a whole book on theory, that is the method that we use here. When you look at traditional thought, for example, you would not. There are sort of major books like, say, the Muqaddimah of Kitab al-Umm of a Shafi'i, or if you find the book of Ibn Khaldun, there are these texts as such, but otherwise you are presented with a lot of material, and so you have to spend a lot of time reading it with that kind of. I hope that it makes sense to you, first of all, that I put this forward. Obviously, I think that one of the things is how can you turn it into something useful. But at least Nadeem thinks, okay, so that's okay, that's fine. One is not good enough. But so yeah, so I hope that is why I did it. But I'm always aware that it is only one view, because I'm aware that the fact that it might be used somewhat differently. But for this, I didn't explore that much. For the last maybe 10 years or so, I read a lot of Sufi texts, just as a pastime, as a kind of a read. I read a lot because I just, first time I read Jalaluddin Rumi, and then after that I find a lot of insightful. I find them to be very insightful about Sufi tafsirs, actually. We don't call it tafsir, but it commentaries on the Quran. So I suppose that sort of just rubs off on you when you're writing something.